I've had many requests to take a look at a recent game from the Chinese Team Championship, and I'm very happy to cover that game now. Tremendous. I hope you enjoy this. I'm taking a little break from my coverage of Capablanca's games, but I will return to him very soon. So here we go. With the white pieces, Bai Jinshi, he's 18 years old, he's already rated 2553, yet another prospect for the future, and playing with the black pieces, Ding Liren, so already three-time Chinese champion. He's 25 years old, and as we all know, he has recently qualified for the Candidates Tournament, the first Chinese player ever to do so. Bai Jinshi with white, so we have a standard Nimzo Indian. Knight f3, of course, e3, g3, or queen c2, of course, all normal moves there. In playing knight f3, you allow the bishop to still come out to g5. Of course, e3 would return to normal Rubinstein systems, but instead we have bishop g5, more adventurous. So trying to exploit the fact that this bishop has already come out to this diagonal, but of course that means it's less easy to break this pin because, well, black is hardly likely to drop the bishop back to e7. So it becomes instantly more double-edged after this move. However, you'll notice that in playing bishop g5, white is neglecting his kingside development. Bear that one in mind. Black strikes back in the center with c5. Looks very logical while the king is still in the middle, and also potentially opens up a line for the queen to apply more pressure on this diagonal. e3. C takes d4 from black, and now, well, of course the normal move would be to simply recapture with the pawn. And here, well, it already feels to me as though black has sufficient counterplay in the middle of the board. I've played this system a couple of times with black, and because white still has to take care of his king in the middle, then black is fine. I mean, for example, a game between Mamedyarov and Carlsen went like this, and already, well, there's nothing wrong with black's position here. Very easy development. But instead of recapturing with the pawn, which is solid, white played queen takes d4. It's interesting when you put an engine onto this position, then queen takes d4 is the top move of, well, the engines that I've seen. To me, this looks like an odd move because, of course, black is able to hit the queen straight away, gaining time for his development. Well, this is only, according to my database, only been played once before by two not very strong players. The game went to queen h4, and after this, well, they reached an endgame, which is very typical of the Nimzo Indian, where this is a slight structural defect, but actually often this pawn comes to f5 and is quite useful. And here, well, black develops very easily. The game is roughly level, but I mean, black is absolutely fine there. In this game, queen d3 was played, which of course allows a rook to come to the d file, but it's an ugly move, I've got to say, because it blocks the bishop from its taking up its natural square, and the queen is also slightly vulnerable here. But it's not so silly, as the rook can come to d1. So let's see, h6, so the bishop is now driven back, and we can see that here is where the game is double-edged, because if black wants to break this pin, he either has to bring the bishop back to e7, involving a loss of time, and then white can start to organize himself and apply pressure on the d file, or he's got to play g5, and then instantly the game becomes double-edged, as that slightly exposes black's king. But for the moment, Ding strikes in the center. Again, to me, a very logical move, because white's king is still in the middle, and in order to exploit any weakness for the, against this potentially isolated pawn, then takes a lot of time, and white's king is in the middle. So for example, after pawn takes, well, after bishop e2, g5, and you can see that already there is pressure on here, and bishop coming to f5 as well. Black must be fine in this kind of position. Very typical Nimzo type position, or Ragozin as well. White played rook d1. Now, if black wants to play very safely, he could simply trade here and play queen e7. And I don't think there's too much wrong with this position. But instead, Ding seizes the chance to take the initiative with g5 and knight e4. And this also looks very logical. You should also play queen a5 in that position. But knight e4, very logical indeed. So perhaps the queen will come to a5. Perhaps f6. So for example, after bishop e2, queen a5, already pressure here. It looks like the rook is misplaced on d1. There's not a lot of point in it being there. Seems fine for black. So white played knight d2, which to some extent closes that diagonal, but now Ding sees a chance to really take the initiative, and he plays d4. So taking would allow the knight in to attack the queen again. So you can see, you know, this whole idea with queen d3 is very risky indeed. But knight f3, so, well, obviously Bai had seen this possibility and felt that knight f3 is okay, and it probably still is okay for white, but white is under pressure from a very, very early stage. e5. So again, typical to support this pawn, e5 comes up. Ding doesn't mind giving up another pawn because it'll free this bishop on this somewhere along this diagonal, but also open up the e-file while white's king is there. So this feels very logical. And here's, well, obviously now every move is absolutely critical. This could go seriously wrong for white already. So for example, a simple developing move like bishop e2 and then queen f6 breaks the pin, and now there's simply a threat to take here. So, well, white is surely lost there already. Bai decided to take on e5 with the knight. Bishop e5 is the other move, which I'm sure he spent a long time considering. Because after this, queen f6, well, it's clear that black has compensation here. White is 2 pawns up, but suddenly black's pieces are flying out. And now either knight e6, followed by rook d8, or you could play rook a e8. In both cases, black has very good compensation, and I think during a game, this would be a frightening prospect over the board. So white played knight takes e5, and this is probably okay, but suddenly, well, this possibility to sacrifice the queen, this has been in the air over a couple of moves, but this is the first time when it looks like it's working properly. White has to take the queen, but now we throw in, for recapturing, of course, rook takes, then pawn takes pawn, but for recapturing, of course, we throw in a check. Check here, and here is another very important moment in the game where I'm sure that Bai Jinshi spent a long time considering his options here. So one option is to bring the king up the board. This is the most ambitious, which is what he did in the game. Or white could bring the rook back to d2. And at first glance, this looks absolutely terrifying. It reminds me of this ancient game played by Paul Morphy, this Morphy pin. Morphy had the white pieces and a pin on this diagonal, but it's very, very similar. at first glance looks absolutely awful for white. Black already has a piece and a rook for the queen, but actually white is already threatening to take here, break that pin. Excuse me, it's only a piece, it's not a rook yet. It's only a piece for the queen, but obviously threat to take here and on d2. But yes, white is threatening to give the queen back and simplify. And remember, white would be a pawn up. So black actually has to take the queen. Like this. White is still a pawn up, but black obviously has compensation. It's going to take a little bit of time to bring these pieces into the game. And black should be okay here, has enough compensation. But this is a safe option for white. Of course, one has to foresee that actually in this position it's possible to actually get out of this pin. In any case, white decided not to go for that and brought the king up the board. So takes that pawn off, very important. That pawn was lurking, ready to queen, so that's important. And now, knight a4. This is where Ding's initiative really kicks in. Now, I can imagine that Bai Jinshi got to this position and thought, well, I'm okay. You know, seems like the king is all right. What black is obviously very active, but he must have thought nothing doing here. Now comes Ding's amazing move, and this turns the game into pure art. This is fantastic. Rook d4. So this basically corrals the king. You can see that covering these squares along the fourth rank. So suddenly the threat is to play g4 and knight takes and bishop takes mate. So, well, let's give a few variations. So knight takes c6, we can just play bishop g4 mate. Oh, first of all, we should say if pawn takes rook, then of course we fork king and queen, and in that case black will simply be a piece up there. What about bishop f4, giving the king some room? I'm afraid that also falls prey to this fork, and black wins material. What about e4, trying to close off this possibility? But then we can play rook takes, and in this position the unfortunate situation of white's bishop on g3 means that black wins material. Everything falls into place for black. So threat g4 mate, white plays h3, so black plays h5, reinstating that threat of g4 and mate. So in order to get out of this, white has to make room for the king, so he plays a very unfortunate move, bishop h2, and after this check that allows the king to go to g3, but the bishop obviously in a terrible position. And now, well, here's a very interesting moment where, well, the initial flurry has brought, well, a very strange position. Now Ding's moves are really beautiful. Rook d2, so queen takes and then knight check again, winning material. So the queen moves on, a knight check, the king is driven up the board. So king f4 here loses in a very nice way, rook f2. Now if the knight comes back, then black simply grabs material and also threatens mates with bishop f5 and rook d8. So this is winning. Or king takes, check, and the rook comes into play. We'll see more of this rook in the game, and that is checkmate. Wonderful stuff. So the king came up to h4. So this is a bit trickier. Ding gave a check, has driven the king right up the board, and now, well, I think there's more than one way to go here, but this is really beautiful. King g7. Ding is preparing to move the queen's bishop and then bring the rook across to h8 and checkmate. And you can see white pieces scattered in the corners of the board don't have a chance really against this. But of course, white thrashed on, bishop f4. So he wants to give a check here. Bishop f5. This is the only way to stave off immediate disaster, to bring this bishop into the game. Now, various ways. Let's see. Pawn takes. This allows a very beautiful checkmate like this. What about knight takes? Then there's a check here. And we can simply take the knight and then come back to attacking the king with these kind of moves. In this situation, black is actually ahead on material. Queen takes b7 played. Looks the most critical as it's attacking lots of lumps. Again, Ding is very cool. Simply taking this, and this allows the rook to come into the game again and controlling very important squares. So it'll be easier to catch the king. So we have, let's see this one. Queen takes c6. Knight g3 is checkmate. That's, yeah, the immediate threat in the position, having got rid of this f-pawn. So bishop g5 gives the king a square, but, well, it looks absolutely desperate. And now rook h8, a fantastic move, preparing king g7 and mate on the h-file. Knight takes. Now this allows white to block on h6 if, and also attacks the rook, of course. So if king here, then knight takes. So bishop g6 check. If king h4, then check. And we have a wonderful mate with 2 knights and 2 bishops. In the game, white played king takes g4, and, well, there is still no escape after this very fine move. And here white resigned. Knight e5 check. So if the king goes back, then we've just seen that checkmate. That's very nice, or something similar. So what happens if this knight is taken? Knight takes. We can do it with checks. Bishop f5. And now black can choose which way to go. There's king g7, and we use the rook to give a checkmate. Or, I rather like this actually, king g8, check. And when the bishop blocks, then knight g3 is checkmate. Well, that's just a really inspiring game. Superbly played by Ding Liren, who has such a feel for the initiative. I do hope that we'll see that kind of play when it comes to the Candidates Tournament in March.